The first thing we did was start to remove some of the panels from the car where the cables will run through. We placed the unit to make it visually appealing outside the driver's view, and then briefly positioned the wire so it fits into the car nicely. Then we removed the panel so the cable would be able to go to the fuse box. The fuse box is in a different location in every vehicle, so you will need to find where it is in the specific vehicle you are working on. Currently, our installer is driving the cable that would run to the camera, so he can see how it will line up. The panel that he removed will lead directly to the fuse box, so this installation will be very unobtrusive. Our installer is currently tying up the slack and hiding it neatly behind where the panel will be when it is replaced. Make sure to leave enough room so that the wire doesn't pull too harshly on the cable. You can also put the panels back as you go. It makes it easier for yourself and easier for cleanup. When connecting to the fuse box itself, we would recommend ADA circuits. It allows for less intrusive install, but the inline circuits are provided so that the ADA circuits are not needed. Currently, we're trying to look for the proper wires to connect to. When testing for your wires, if you know what color your wires are, try to tap into one of the wires that aren't major to the car. So usually a blower cable is smart and is the best one to tap into. But if unknown, any wire will work, just make sure it is a proper ignition wire. Currently the installer is trying to find a cable. He is cutting a little bit of shielding away and testing if the cable is a constant or an ignition. With ADA fuses, you would check the fuse itself and see if that was a constant or ignition. Here we're trying to do a military splice into the cable, so we're going to have to check cables individually until we find one that gives us both constant and ignition. Currently the installer is trying to find a way to get a stable ground so we can test the wires. He's testing the kit with a multimeter to see if there's any conductivity going through the wire. You can set it to the DC voltage setting to test if the wire is a constant wire or a ignition wire. If the vehicle is off and the wire is still giving power, you know it's constant. If the vehicle is in its ignition state and then it's only giving power, a number, then you know it's an ignition wire. If the vehicle is off, the ignition wire will give it a 0. Don't be scared to test multiple wires. You usually won't find it on your first try unless you know the schematic of the truck. If you're doing the same vehicle, try to remember the color, take pictures of the wires, so it's easier for the next time to find which wire is ignition. This process may take several minutes, so don't be scared to keep on testing. Usually if you have the schematic of the vehicle, it would be a lot easier to find the cable that you need. If you're shooting in the dark, like we currently are, it might take several minutes. You have the schematic, it will usually tell you the color, or at least the location of a wire that is constant or ignition. Once again, trying to find a wire that is not as important is ideal, but any wire that's an ignition and a constant is usable. And once again, if you're using an ADA fuse, you check the fuse box and check every fuse itself. It tends to be quicker and safer and less intrusive on the unit, easier for install and uninstall the unit. Currently, the installer is trying to make sure all the wires are hidden so they don't get into the way of the driver and inhibit his driving ability while the car is in motion. Making sure he won't kick or hit the wires, which will either stop him from driving safely or ruining the unit and the wiring itself. Pre-planning your wire placement is always ideal. It's always better to take more time with your wire placement and then not risk it getting ruined during the install or during everyday use of the car. Make sure to go slowly so you're not ruining any of the wires by pulling them through tight areas. And then once you find the right wire, start peeling back a bit of the shielding so you're able to splice in the wire. If you're doing a military splice, make sure to be very careful while pulling back the wire. You don't want to damage the cable itself. Make sure not to rush this part. It is very easy to ruin the wire. And if you are installing the unit in a military splice, try to always use the same cable to keep everything consistent and clean. Take pictures of the cable so you know which one it is and its location. Try to pull back enough shielding so you're able to do it. It's always better to do as minimal amount as possible so it's least intrusive if you're splicing in. If you're using an ADA fuse, this is unnecessary because the fuse will go into where the previous fuse was, adding it with no intrusive and no ruining of wires. Here our installer is going to show you how to do a military splice. You split the wires on the vehicle, separate them, and then put the wire that you're using in between it. Then you would wrap it around to keep it secure and then put tape over it so the wire isn't exposed. Make sure to wrap it very tightly so the wire doesn't become dislodged, and then use a healthy amount of electrical tape to ensure that the cable isn't exposed to the elements. You do this for both the constant and the ignition. Make sure you're connecting the right wire, constant and ignition. If you don't do this correctly, the unit will not work. And if you're removing the unit with a military splice, just be very careful to not damage the wire that you connected to in the first place. This was our installer's constant wire, so now he's going to do the same for his ignition wire. He's going to put a little zip tie around where he connected the wires to make sure the connection stays secure. This is a very good idea to make sure that the cable never becomes dislodged. It's also a good place to remind you where you connected the cable, so it's easier to find. Now our installer will hunt for the ignition wire. You might have to test many wires if you don't have a schematic for the vehicle. This is normal. Just make sure when you splice into the wires or you cut open the shielding to cover it up again with electrical tape and not to ruin the wire and not leave it exposed. For the first splice with the constant wire, we used a military splice to show you how it's done. For the second one, we connected straight to the fuse box using an ADA circuit. The ADA circuit is a lot easier and more efficient at doing it, and that's why it went so quickly. The third thing we did was connect the ground. We found the car's ground wire right beside where we did the military fuse, so we connected it there using a ring terminal. Currently, our installer is making the cables line up nicer. Always try to clean up your job after you've installed the unit. You don't want loose wires and extra hanging wires around, because that could cause a problem if it's not tied down. If you can't find the car's ground near where you have your terminal placed, then you can use a tap screw to make your own ground into the car. We were lucky and the car's ground was very near where we used the military splice. But if you aren't, it's very simple to either find a ground that's nearby, usually is, or use a tap screw to tap into the car. If you do use a tap screw, make sure the ground is a stable ground, because that could have issues for the system. Try to also, if you've taken wires from the main wire circuit of the car, make sure they're back where they originally were placed to not cause the next installer any problems and to make sure the car is working as it should be. Our installer is currently hiding, zip tying, slack into an open area, which is easily accessible for us, and if another installer has to come by, easily accessible for them. Make sure that all slack is properly tied up and out of the way. Our installer is going to replace all the panels, put them back how he found them, trying to ensure that no cables get ruined or pushed out of the way in the process. Try to keep a mental note of how you pulled off the panels, if possible. It'll make reinstalling the panels much easier. Since the camera cables were already ran in the first part of the video, all the installer has to do now is alcohol down the areas that the camera, the GPS, and the LTE cables will be ran and stuck to. Our installer is lining up where his camera would want to go. The camera position should be as center as possible, with it being outside the driver's line of view. Placing the camera so you can see where it should be is always the best option. Make sure the camera is outside of the sun bar, and make sure it's also inside the windshield wiper area. Take your time on this part since you only can do this once. VHB tape is very sticky, so once it's placed, it's going to be stuck there. Taking off the back panel might be the easiest option. Placing that first and then placing the camera after. Make sure when it is placed that you push everywhere on the panel to make sure that the VHB tape has full stickiness of the surface. Once this is placed, it tends to not come off, so make sure you stuck it well and in a right position. Once again, do not rush this part. It is crucial that it is placed properly, straight, and where it's inside its intended area. Make sure to reattach the camera if you did place the panel on first firmly, and then to hide the cables. You will repeat this sticking process for the GPS and the two LTE antenna cables. Our installer dislodged another panel just so he can get the GPS more out of view. Make sure the GPS has direct visibility to the sky. This is crucial for the GPS working properly. Once again, take your time with this positioning. Once it's stuck on, it cannot be moved, or at least not moved easily. If you do have to move any of these units, I would suggest buying more VHB tape and reapplying it to where it needs to be. Try to hide as many cables as possible. If you can't all, that's fine. It makes the install look cleaner, and it's also safer for the driver not getting distracted by hanging loose cables. The cables are fairly long, so make sure to tie up any excess slack and make sure that the cable is secured tightly. Also, if possible, connect the cables as you're going along so you don't forget to connect the cable at the end of the install. There's a lot of space above the driver's head in the roof of the car, so it is fairly easy to hide all the cables up there. Next, for the LTE antennas, you want to connect them to the windshield of the car in direct view of the sky for best conductivity. And then once all cables that have to be connected are connected, and all the ones that aren't are tied up correctly. You can hide them in the ceiling of the car. Try to keep it as clean and neat as possible. Make sure that the wires don't interfere with the headliner too much, or else the headliner won't sit properly. Now we're approaching the end of the install. All that the installer is doing now is making sure that all of the units that he placed are placed correctly, the cables are hidden, and that the car is back at its previous state. The last part of the physical installation is the adjustment of the camera. You can go on the Vase app and view how the camera is looking. Usually about 10% of the bumper showing is ideal. Don't show too much bumper or else you're losing view. Don't shoot too little or you're missing out on the front of the hood. Now the physical part of the installation is complete. All that's left is to turn on the vehicle and call support to verify that the GPS, the LTE, and the camera is all connecting as intended.